join us. You will see that we're just waiting to stream, and now we're now streaming onto our YouTube as well. So yeah, once again, everybody, welcome along to our Zoom and YouTube webinar. As always, we're always happy to see so many of you attend these live webinars. And again, sorry, just to repeat for our normal followers, but this is a really easy way and a good way that you can continue to support world horse welfare and ultimately horse welfare in many ways. So if you can encourage other friends and family or any other sort of horse colleagues to attend and watch these webinars, that's, as I say, a really great way in which you can help to support world horse welfare. Anyone can register for free to watch these, and we feel the best way to participate them is to register and come and watch them through Zoom, as it helps you to be able to participate and interact a little bit more easily. But you can also watch them through live on YouTube, and you can do that also by subscribing to our YouTube channel and watch back later. And the links to that should now be available in the chat. So tonight we are delighted to be joined by Dr. Sebastian McBride from Aberystwyth University, as well as Dr. Andrew Hemmings from the Royal Agricultural University, to explore the world of equine stereotypic behaviours. This always is a two-way conversation. So please, if you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A tab to ask any questions for Andrew and Seb. And then if you are on Zoom, you can use the chat function on there again to ask any questions, and we will whiz them into the webinar tonight. If you've got any, just want to do some general chats or comments, then there's the chat function as well on both of those platforms as well. We really hope that you enjoyed today's discussion, and as I say, it would be great to share this with others and get other people to attend with us. If you have any ideas on any future topics as well, we would love to hear from you as well, and you can email us on education@worldhorsewelfare.org, or just let us know in the chat just now, and we will consider every option. So if you just bear with me while I share my screen quickly. I just want to, for those of you that are on Zoom, will be able to see our poll question now and be able to take part. If you're on YouTube, you can always add your answer to the poll question in the comments. So, true or false? Stereotypic behaviours are a stress response. And while you're considering the poll question, I'm going to do a couple of introductions to our speakers. So, as I say, we have Sebastian McBride with us tonight, and he's studied originally at Liverpool and then at Edinburgh. He then took up his current position in 1996 in what was the Institute of Rural Sciences. He then left so it's not his current role. So he left the institute in 2005 to extend his research interest in cognitive robotics at the Department of Computer Science, and then neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. But then, however, he has now returned to Aberystwyth in 2016 to take up an appointment as a lecturer in biosciences. And we often ask, I say, our speakers if they have any sort of interesting story or quirky fact. And Seb's quirky fact for tonight is that he is an excellent salsa dancer, and apparently is him and his partner a performance to be seen. So that's quite a nice one. And joining Sebastian tonight is Andrew Hemmings. So he's a professor at the Associate Professor at Equine Research Leadership at the RAU. He specialises in equine behaviour neuroscience research. He pioneered the use of blink rate assessment to gain insights into the functioning of dopamine pathways, and that's a technique that's now used throughout the equine science community. Long-term aims include development of brain-focused indicators on equine welfare status, cognitive profile, temperament, and even predictors of competition performance in equine athletes. When we asked Andy about his quirky fact, and I'm probably going to do this quite a disservice, Andy, and try not to take the focus too far away for tonight, but his quirky fact is that he also undertakes research into searching for mystery big cats around the UK, and this will be involving looking at carcasses and maybe gaining DNA samples from a potential predator, or looking at sort of teeth print sort of spaces analysis, and then trying to identify the predator from there. And as I say, I could probably talk about or ask lots of questions around this, but we will move on. But yeah, that's a nice introduction to both of our speakers tonight. So while yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to ask Basil if we can have a quick look at those poll results, please. So we have a very overwhelming response of 91% say that stereotypic behaviours are a stress response. So thank you very much for your participation there. Right, I am now going to pass the reins over, I think initially to Sebastian, if you're happy to share your screen, and we will see how we get on. Perfect, that's looking great. So if you just unmute yourself, Sebastian, and you're good to go.
Okay, there we go. And hopefully everybody can see that okay. Yep, so obviously we're here to talk about equine stereotypy, and I'm going to do the first bit, sort of an introduction as to what these behaviors are about, and then sort of deal with them from a sort of causal perspective. And then Andy's going to come in afterwards and then talk about the implications of that causality apart from stereotypy. So I think one of the main messages is going to be that stereotypy is about brain changes, and those brain changes bring about stereotypy. But what else does that bring about as a result of those changes in the horse's brain? So looking at it from a slightly different perspective. And then I guess one of the things we won't be talking about is the function of stereotypy. Not as part of this talk, but that's something that we can potentially follow up on in terms of the question session at the end. Okay, so just to give you a sense of stereotypy, not just particular to the horse, particular to a range of species, predominantly found in zoo and farm animals, and reflects the environments that those animals are kept in to some degree. But you also find it in companion animal species as well, as you can see from this tail chasing than in dogs. But like I say, so, captive animal species as well. So here we've got weaving behavior in the elephant. So very similar to what you see in the horse, and we'll see that in a second. So this movement of the head left to right with sort of contralateral lifting of the forelimb. And then also you see it in captive species like large cats, where they do this figure of 8 pacing. And even if you visit zoos or areas where captive species, exotic captive species are kept, these large cats, then even though you might not see them pacing quite often, you'll see the figure of 8 ground into the ground because they're doing it so much. Also farm animal species, we see this less now just because some of the regulations that's coming in terms of the way that we can keep farm animals. But pigs were always a very good example of farm animal stereotypy, where they do a lot of repetitive chewing of chains and bar biting. Okay, in terms of the horse then, and if we use this standard definition of stereotypy, that it's repetitive, that it's in an invariant behavior, that has no apparent goal or function, then the 3 main behaviors that come up are crib biting, weaving, and box walking. So crib biting then is an oral stereotypy, and this is a sort of general partitioning that we can apply to stereotypy for most species, that a lot of stereotypies tend to be either oral in nature or they tend to be locomotory in nature. So crib biting, oral stereotypy, and then we've got weaving and box walking as sort of variants of locomotory stereotypy in the horse. And in general, they're performed between 7 and 9-10% of the population. So in actual fact, that's quite a lot of horses. If we say that there's 1 million horses in the UK, or just slightly under that, we're possibly talking then about 100,000 horses in the UK currently performing these behaviors. So quite a substantive amount. So here's crib biting, that you'll all probably be familiar with. Normally done, like I said, very much in the context of feeding. You can see here the horse incise her teeth onto a solid object and leaning back, and note then the contraction of those ventral muscles of the neck. So those are muscles that are running from the sternum up into the base of the larynx and on into the hyoid apparatus. You can really see the contraction of those muscles as the horse there is leaning back. Occasionally, for some animals, they're also taking in a gulp of air. Previous work has shown that gulp of air tends to go to the esophagus, but tends not to go any further than that. Crib biting, like I said, very related to eating, but also the type of food that the animal is eating. So if you look at the crib biting rate here, if we were to measure that out, it's about 1 crib bite every 15 seconds, so about 4 crib bites then per minute. If we contrast that then, same horse here, but I've just given this horse some cereal-based concentrate, and you can see then that the crib biting rate then intensifies quite significantly. So horse is just eating here, it will then come back to that same door, and then you will see that is quite an enhanced amount of crib biting that the horse is going to do. And in fact, if we count this up, then it's coming to about 4 or 5 crib bites per 15 seconds. So about 20 to 25 crib bites per minute. So it's a 4 to 5 fold increase in the amount of crib biting. And that's a reliable response that you will get in a crib biting horse. If you come with a palatable feedstuff, then you will get this very exaggerated crib biting response. And so you find crib biting, the majority of crib biting is done in response to eating, and for that reason then is often referred to as being a postprandial behavior. And because of that, then, and it's very much, what we were getting there between the two food. So we had hay, which is a low palatable food substrate, and then we've got cereal-based concentrate, which is a high palatability food substrate. So this element of this factor of palatability then was always seen as being a sort of a critical factor in terms of the explanation of these behaviors, in that palatable feeds tend to be starch rich, they're cereal-based, and they tend to reduce the pH of the cecum. And it was generally speculated that the acidic consequence of eating cereal-based concentrates, these palatable feedstuffs, then was in actual fact the cause of crib biting, and very much thought that this was then linked to visceral discomfort to do with that gut acidity. A lot of that thinking actually stemmed from work right back in 1998 by Johnson et al. They were using a non-therapeutic antibiotic for vaginomycin, which it's not used in this country, but it's used in Australia for the purpose of reducing laminitis. And that supplement actually prevents the normal decrease in cecal pH associated with eating, with ingesting concentrates. And that was linked in this particular study. That was linked. So a lot of these horses were doing grasping type behavior. It didn't seem to be full blown crib biting, but what they noticed was that on the vaginomycin, then you weren't getting that grasping type behavior. And the paper was sort of written up behaviorally as such. A lot of people got onto that then and started, as a result, then testing essentially antacids for horses. So various substances are equivalent to a sort of human rennet, as it were, sort of calcium-based supplements that were all about then sort of buffering the GI tract in a way that, again, would reduce the acidic consequences of eating cereal-based concentrates. And the results of that were semi-conclusive. So some studies seem to find that it had a crib biting reducing effect, but other studies found that that was not the case. The general thinking at the time seemed to be was very much about that the crib biting was involved in maybe producing additional alkaline saliva, and that again in some way was maybe buffering the consequences of eating these acidic cereal-based concentrates. But other work that sort of come along after that, really looking at the amount of saliva that's produced as a result of crib biting, it is significantly more, but not in a way that it has any sort of biological significance. So there is more saliva produced, but it wouldn't have an effect in terms of altering the pH of the GI tract. Okay, so just moving on to weaving then, and again, you'll all be familiar with this. Again, this sort of lateral movement of the head from left to right. Was fortunate to find this particular horse. So these horses had windows then out. So as you were walking down the main corridor, you could sort of see the back of the horse. So here's a weaving horse as seen from the back, and you can really get a sense of just the locomotory nature of this particular stereotypy. So again, lateral movement of the head, but limbs that are coming up and down. The horse is nearly doing piaffe on the spot there. So very locomotory in nature. Box walking, then we tend to see this less. And, you know, box walking requires extra space, and quite often the stable doesn't have that extra space. But where the horse has that extra space, then rather than doing weaving, it will tend to do this box walking behavior as well. I like this video because it really shows just the invariant nature of this set of behavioral sequences. So if you note where the horse's head is going down, as it goes back and forth, it nearly looks like this video is on repeat. That's not actually the case. So the horse dips its head there and then dips its head there, and then it's back along. So if you were to put markers on that horse and sort of work out where exactly its movements are in three-dimensional space, you would find very little variation as it sort of repeats this very invariant behavioral sequence. So those are the three main ones, but that's not to say that there aren't other ones as well. So here's a horse here that was a weaver, lateral movement of the head, but they put an anti-weave bar up, and that then morphed into vertical movement of the head. So this is not a clinical head shaker, as brought about by, for example, trigeminal neuralgia. That's not the case here. This actually is a weaving animal that has then morphed its behavior into a vertical movement, given the restrictions that it was put under. The one on the right here, this in fact is a stereotypic tongue roller. So very difficult to see from the video, but you would get these very repetitive sort of movements of the tongue within the mouth that again would go on for quite protracted periods of time. And down here then we've got a horse then that's very repetitive in its licking behavior. Okay, so in actual fact, you know, we're talking about 10% of the population. That's 10% of horses that are crib biting, weaving, or box walking. If we were to take some of these other stereotypies into account, then in actual fact, the number goes up quite substantially. And some people have estimated that between 80 and 90% of the horse population are performing some form of stereotypic behavior. Okay, so what I just want to do now, folks, is present you with a behavioral model. So this is really where, you know, so me and Andy go way back, as I think we were mentioned at the start, and really in terms of the research that we've been doing into equine stereotypy, a lot of it sort of stemmed around this behavioral model that was put together quite some time ago, 1988, by Hughes and Duncan. Barry Hughes and Ian Duncan put this together. It was a model to describe goal-directed behaviors, but it was also very much the motivation was to, in fact, put together a model to understand the underlying motivation of stereotypy, how these behaviors are essentially originating. So I just want to give you a sense of this model. But in the first instance, I just want to talk about goal-directed behaviors. What are they? And I've got a nice little video clip here that sort of demonstrates that quite nicely. The thing about goal-directed behaviors is that they've got two phases, an appetitive phase and a consummatory phase. So this is a chimp cognition study. And in this particular study, the chimps had to work out that they needed to put the boxes together and find the stick and get on top of the boxes with the stick in order to be able to access the banana. All of that. So the goal was obviously to get the banana. All of that which the chimp was doing is very much within the appetitive phase. Once it actually gets the banana and then transitions through to eating the banana, is then moving from the appetitive phase through to the consummatory phase. So this is what goal-directed behaviors are. So they're all about trying to attain the goal, and you have all of those appetitive actions leading up to the point of consumption. Okay, so this was the model then that Hughes and Duncan put together. And what they were saying was that depending on the sort of the situation, the circumstance of the animal, both externally and internally, so in terms of its internal physiology, but also in the context of the environment that it finds itself in, it can become motivated to attain certain goals. So motivation then gets elicited to attain a particular goal. It then transitions into very quickly into this appetitive phase. And the thing about the appetitive phase is that it's self-sustaining, that there's a positive feedback loop that keeps the animal on track, keeps it on point in terms of trying to attain this goal that it has set itself. If it performs all of the correct appetitive behaviors like we just saw there with the chimp, it then moves through to the consummatory phase. And then there's predominantly, there's an initially there's a positive feedback loop sort of that sustains motivation, but in general, once the animal moves through to the consummatory phase, you have all of the functional consequences of that. So for example, again, if we think about the chimp, that's to do with the fact that it's got the banana, it's eaten the banana, there's no longer a banana hanging that it can see, but that's also changed its internal physiology as well. So all of that then feeds back in a negative way to then attenuate the motivation for the goal. Okay, so this was the general model that Hughes and Duncan were then putting forward. And what they were then saying was that stereotypies, the essence of stereotypies, are all about the animal being unable to transition from the appetitive phase through to the consummatory phase, that somehow that is blocked. And that blocking is normally normally reflects the restrictive nature of the environment that the animal finds itself in. So that's the point of stereotypy. So that's where stereotypy then develops, because the animal can't transition from appetitive through to consummatory. So in that sense, then stereotypy is very much about when goals cannot be achieved. Here you can see me in a pretty nasty fashion, but just to demonstrate the particular point, I've offered the horse the food, but I haven't given the horse the food. And you can see all of that sort of frustration, appetitive response that you're getting from this horse in wanting to attain this goal that it cannot attain because of the restrictive nature of the environment that it finds itself in. Just to say that I obviously did give the horse the food after I'd taken this video clip. So what becomes apparent then from that model is that the level of motivation will determine the level of perpetuation within the loop. So stereotypies are very much the animal being stuck within this appetitive loop. So it's motivated, but it can't attain the goal. So you're getting all of that appetitive frustration type behavior that eventually becomes stereotypic in nature. And what theoretically becomes apparent from that is that the more motivated an animal is to attain a goal that it can't attain, then the more likely it is to get stuck in this perpetual appetitive loop, and therefore the more likely that stereotypy will develop. So if the animal is not that motivated to attain the goal, it will then get about other behaviors. It won't be completely and solely focused on that thing that it cannot attain. It will then go off and distract itself by doing something else. So the level of motivation to attain the goal that it cannot attain is critically important in terms of whether stereotypy develops or not. Okay. So in terms of the research that myself and Andy were doing quite some time ago now, the question then came up as to really then, are those animals that perform stereotypy more motivated towards goal-directed behavior than animals that are not stereotypic and therefore not as sort of motivated to goals that they cannot attain? So we've got a sort of phenotype, what we would describe there as a phenotypic difference between stereotypy and non-stereotypy animals. And this is really important, because what we find is that we've got stereotypy. We can have a bunch of horses in the same environment, but only some of them become stereotypic. So there's a phenotype. There's a type of animal that is predisposed to becoming stereotypic. And I guess the question is then, are those stereotypy predisposed animals, are those animals what we might call a hyper-motivated phenotype? They're much more motivated to attain goals. And when you place them in an environment where they can't attain goals, that is why stereotypy arises in those animals and not in other animals. So that was the question that we were asking. And there'd be lots of different ways that you could test that to sort of work out whether that group of animals is generally more motivated towards goals or not. But we took a very neurophysiological approach. And at this time, there was a lot of research that was coming out that was very much identifying the part of the brain that was responsible for motivation, the sort of the motivation pathway. And that pathway is referred to then as the mesoaccumbens pathway of the brain. And the neurotransmitter involved is dopamine. So if you've got increased dopaminergic or increased activity of dopamine as a neurotransmitter acting along that particular pathway, then that suggests that you've got an animal that is much more motivated in terms of the general behaviors that it performs. Okay, so sorry, I'll just go back there. So we've got then that pathway, the mesocumbens pathway. It's running from a part of the brain called the VTA, the ventral tegmentum area, and it's running up to the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is part of another structure called the striatum. So we're going to get a little bit into the detail of the neurophysiology. It's not going to be hugely complicated, but just giving this additional information, I think, gives us additional insight as to, why stereotypies are rising. And again, whenever Andy comes in, as to the ramifications of that from a sort of other behavior perspective. Okay, so we've got the striatum, and it's got three regions. So we've got the caudate, the putamen, and then the nucleus accumbens that I've just been talking about. Okay, so we've got sort of what we refer to as dorsal structures that are up the top, and we've got ventral structures, those that are down the bottom. So caudate, putamen are dorsal, nucleus accumbens then down the bottom. Okay, so the thing about the striatum is that it's heavily modulated by another structure within the brain called the midbrain. And the midbrain can be divided into two portions, again, dorsal and ventral, a top bit and a bottom bit. And the top bit is called substantia nigra. The bottom bit is called the ventral tegmentum area, the VTA, again, which I've just referred to. So the motivation pathway is running from the VTA to the nucleus accumbens. This is our mesoaccumbens pathway responsible for motivation. We've also got then other pathways that are running dorsally, and those are referred to they're referred to as the nigrostriatal pathway, and they're not particularly relevant to what we're discussing tonight, but it's important to note them. In actual fact, it's the nigrostriatal pathway that starts to degrade during the clinical condition of human Parkinson's disease. Okay, so a little bit of neuroanatomy and some of the pathways that we're interested in there. So, okay, right, we're going back to this question then. Are those animals that perform stereotypy more motivated towards goal-directed behaviors? And so we can potentially measure this then in the context of dopaminergic activity along this mesoaccumbens pathway. And so the question then becomes, do animals performing stereotypy have altered, and in fact, I would change that question, do they have enhanced mesoaccumbens dopamine physiology? Because it's that pathway that's responsible for motivation. And our hypothesis is that those animals that are stereotypic are also what we might call a hyper-motivated phenotype. Okay, and the answer to that question is yes. You find an upregulation of dopaminergic activity along that particular pathway, along the mesoaccumbens pathway. And what we're actually looking at here is rodent data. So this is sort of where, again, myself and Andy were coming in terms of the research that we were doing. This was work that was done by Simona Khabib, who's based down in Rome. And we were very interested in this work because it seemed to fit with this general sort of hyper motivation phenotype hypothesis of stereotypy. So if you were to stress out certain strains of mice, you would find that you get an upregulation along that pathway and that those animals then became stereotypic. So the question then became, what about horses? So if we were to take the brains out of horses and we were to look at if we could measure then the level of dopaminergic activity along that mesoaccumbens pathway, that pathway responsible for motivation, would we find upregulated, enhanced levels of activity in stereotypy versus non-stereotypy horses? So that's what we did. We spent a lot of quality time in abattoirs. So all of these animals were designated then were abattoir designated to go sort of into the meat industry. We had the fortune of knowing people within the industry, so we could go and screen those animals and work out whether they were stereotypic or non-stereotypic. So we knew exactly the phenotype that we were looking at. We would then take the brains out, and then we could then do some lab work to assess the level of dopaminergic activity in this pathway that we're interested in. And again, the answer to our question was yes. We find that nearly exactly the same data that you find in the rodents, you find that in the horses as well. And essentially you're getting this upregulation then of activity within the mesoaccumbens pathway. So you can see there, folks, I'm not going to get sort of too much into the detail of these graphs here, but NA stands for nucleus accumbens, and we've got control animals and stereotypy animals, and you can see we've got two different types of receptor, D1 and D2, and in both cases we've got an upregulation of both of those receptors in the nucleus accumbens region for stereotypy horses when you compare them to non-stereotypy horses. So, you know, that seemed to then confirm our thinking that in actual fact, in a very similar to way what you're finding in the rodents, that the stereotypic phenotype in the horse is also what we might describe as this hyper-motivated phenotype. These animals that are very motivated to attain goals, and when you put them in a restrictive environment where they can't attain those goals, they are then very likely to develop stereotypy. Just also note then at this point, folks, just as a lead into some of the things that Andy's going to be talking about, that as well as finding that upregulation in the nucleus accumbens, also note that we've got a significant downregulation in this region C for D1 receptors with a similar trend for D2 receptors. So that area C, that stands for caudate. So if you can remember, I put up that picture of the striatum, dorsal structures, caudate, putamen. Then one of those regions, the caudate, you find that you've got a significant reduction then in D1 receptors in that part of the brain. Okay, so this is what we found in the horse. Upregulation of the mesoaccumbens pathway, but also this downregulation in the caudate. And Andy will talk more about that in a little bit. So the conclusion that we could come to was that, yes, in the horse, this very much supports this hypermotivation phenotype, that this is the reason why some horses are developing stereotypy in an environment when other horses are not, that they are behaviorally different. They're predisposed because they're very hypermotivated towards goals that they cannot attain.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Seb. So this is where I take over. So what Seb's presented there are some pretty widespread fundamental changes to this brain structure that we call the striatum. And as well as its role in perpetuating and the control of stereotypic behavior, the striatum is also a fundamental group of brain structures where motivation, and critical to this argument, where learning is concerned. So in that video there, you just saw a trainer teaching a horse with a very gentle tap of a schooling whip to gradually go into a bowing position. And very early on in the training of that behavior, anything that approximates a bow will be rewarded with food. So gradually the behavior is shaped until it becomes to resemble something much more akin to what the trainer is asking for. So you've got this sequence of learning that starts off with trial and error, rewarding things that approximate the correct goal, until the behavior becomes more refined and then finally quite automatic. So even the sight of the schooling whip is enough to send the horse into a bow. And so the striatum is really fundamental to the control of this learning sequence. So if you could go on to the next slide, please, Seb. Perfect. So again, the striatum made up of three sub-regions: the nucleus accumbens, the caudate, and the putamen. So how are these structures important to learning? Well, the nucleus accumbens is really important in the initial shaping phases, when we're teaching the initial bowing behavior in response to the tap of the whip, for example, and in response to something that approximates the correct behavior, a food reward is provided. And that's what the nucleus accumbens is all about: attaching pleasure or positive reinforcement to behaviors that we either deem correct, and it's also naturally activated in response to innately rewarding commodities such as food, courtship, mating, and so on. So the nucleus accumbens is really critical to the initial shaping phases. Then, as the behavior becomes more refined and practiced, and that's a critical thing to remember, as the behavior is repeated again and again until it becomes something more refined, the emphasis of neural activity spreads from the nucleus accumbens into the caudatus. And we call the caudatus an action outcome monitoring center. It essentially keeps tabs on the ongoing success of a behavioral policy. So when I bow, do I still get a food reward? That's the sort of thing that the caudatus keeps tabs on. And if the answer to that is yes, with repeated practicing and repeated receiving of a food reward, the neural emphasis or neural activity finally spreads to the putamen. And once the activity is lodged within that brain structure, the behavior comes quite automatic. So as soon as a horse sees the whip, it bows automatically. And this is a type of response that we refer to as a habitual response. And so we call this sort of three-stage process, the process of habit formation. And it's a bit like a habit formation clock, which starts in the nucleus accumbens, spreads to the caudatus, and ends up in the putamen. And next slide, please, Seb. So we've investigated some fairly widespread changes to these structures that occur in the stereotypy performing animal. If you could just click through those, Seb, that would be great. And, you know, we really are talking quite widespread changes, not just a few extra receptors, folks, double the number of dopamine receptors in the nucleus accumbens brain structure and significantly fewer in the caudatus. So we have enhanced activity in the nucleus accumbens, potentially then reduced activity in the caudatus. So how does this affect the habit formation clock? Well, based on research in rodents that involves experimentally induced deactivation of the caudatus, we find that in the context of neural changes such as this, the rapidity of habit formation increases. So it's reasonable for us to postulate that horses that perform stereotypy, that have these alterations, will progress into the realms of habit much quicker. And that's what we set out to test in some of our later work. So our next slide, please, Seb. And so on this next slide, I'm going to talk you through a kind of a habitual response testing protocol. It's a cognitive test called an extinction learning task. And that big sort of green box is what we call a cognitive device, you know, a cognitive testing device, an operant device. We call it all sorts of things. And essentially, this is what the extinction learning task for gauging habit formation is all about. In response to a light and a buzzer, we took 3 groups of horses in our 2015 study, 9 crib biters, 9 weavers, 9 stereotypy-free controls. And we taught them all to press the button following the arrival of the buzzer and the light in response or in return for a food reward. And we had an undergraduate student in the green box posting food into the feed manger below. No, it was actually all computer controlled. Seb designed all of that. It worked perfectly. So we taught our 3 groups of horses, cribbers, weavers, and controls, to press a button in response for a food reward. And they all did that. So next slide, please, Seb. And when they got 10 correct consecutive button presses, we then took the group through 20 post-training repetitions, 20 instances of buzzer, light, press button for food reward, 20 post-training repetitions. And then we did something which you know, you might think it's a little bit unkind. It wasn't really, but we reprogrammed the device such that following the buzzer and the light, the horse would press the button, but would not receive the food reward. And we looked at how many button presses were committed during what we refer to as the extinction phase. And I'd like you to look at the left-hand side of this graph to begin with. And we found that control horses and weavers both stopped pressing the button in the absence of food really, really quickly. However, the crib biting equivalents carried on and on and on, pressing that button in the absence of food reward. We then retrained the horses and tried again with 40 post-training repetitions and found almost an identical pattern. But this, folks, is where it really gets interesting. So next slide, please, Seb. When we looked at task acquisition rate, the number of trials required for crib biters, weavers, and controls to learn that initial, very simple button press, we found something quite surprising. Both crib biters and weavers required significantly fewer trials to get those 10 consecutive button presses in a row. They learned exceptionally quickly in this particular trial. So Seb, just press on again if you wouldn't mind. So these animals learn quickly, but critical to what I want to really convey tonight, in the crib biters, unlearning was difficult. So weavers and cribbers learn really quickly. The cribbers, however, have difficulties with further flexibility, with unlearning, if you like. And I think that's a really crucial message, perhaps, to the way in which we as horse owners train crib biting horses. But this is a cognitive test. What can it ever really tell us about training and performance? So on to the next slide, if that's all right, Seb. Do stereotypy performing horses perform differently in competition? And this is a study that was conducted on just under 1,600 racehorses by Dr. Lonnie Loftus from Askham Bryan University. And at the moment, this is unpublished. But what Lonnie looked at was the time form rating of weavers, crib biters, box walkers, windsuckers who perform the gulp without the grasp, and also NSB, which is non-stereotypic behavior. So control horses, essentially. And I know very little about racing, I'll be completely honest, but I know time form is one of the most relied upon measures of competition aptitude in a racing context. And the higher your time form rating, the better. And so let's imagine, you know, the greatest racehorse of all time was Frankel, or still is Frankel. He still lives over in Newmarket, and his time form at retirement was 147. And the time form of Scherger, I believe, was around 140. An elite racehorse will usually have a time form rating of 130, and an average to reasonable racehorse will be around the 100. So the horses we were looking at in this trial are all what you might consider average Joe type racehorses. But really, quite surprisingly, what was found here was the weavers and the crib biters had a higher time form rating, therefore a better racing track record compared to the non-stereotypy equivalents, which I think is really interesting data, because it forces us to rethink our view of stereotypy performing horses. And after all, is owner perception that often leads to reduced welfare. And if we can get this kind of data out into industry and say, well, tentatively, these guys seem to perform quite well, perhaps we can undo some of the negative associations that form around these behaviors. And on to the next slide, please, Seb. So what do the trainers think? We asked a group of about 400 trainers and assistant trainers around ease of training stereotypy horses, and this is by sort of current PhD student. Most of them thought there was no difference in ease of training. And then, as you can see there, around 50 thought they were harder to train, around 25 thought they were easier to train. So we got good competition performance, and then trainers saying there's probably no real tangible difference in ease of training. So that's racing. And if we could click on a slide, Seb, what about eventing? Well, Seb's showed you a video of him about 30 years ago, and this is a picture of me back in 2009, and I wrote this piece for the veterinary clinic of Horse and Hound. Do crib biters make better competition horses? And I had the honor of interviewing Andrew Nicholson, and his view was that crib biters are generally more switched on individuals. They're the sort of horse that'll get him out of trouble if he drops a rein in the middle of a sticky combination. And he really likes crib biters in that respect. So here we have, again, in another discipline, some tentative evidence. And on again, Seb, if that's okay. This is a piece of work that was done by an MSc student way back in 2009. And she looked at a cohort of eventers of novice, intermediate, advanced, then your badminton winning elite. She got quite high numbers there, I think is worth pointing out. And she merged stereotypies, weaving, crib biting and box walking into a single group, which wasn't ideal. But she found prevalence rates in the novice, intermediate and advanced animals to be roughly in line with the published accounts that Seb went over earlier. However, in the elite horses, the prevalence jumps to 24.4%. And when we looked at the management differences between elite and advanced, we didn't find anything significant. So again, this tentatively suggests that our elite horses, that stereotypy performance seems to somehow go hand in hand with positive competition performance. And, you know, a lot of this could be genetic, I think. And one of the things that me and Seb want to do looking forward is to unravel the genetic basis, the heritable component of stereotypic behavior, and develop a genetic test. But once we've developed that genetic test, there are two ways we could use that. We could screen mares and stallions and select against those breeding pairs to reduce gene frequency within the population. If we ever did that, I think there could be the possibility of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There is a chance that we could be selecting against some of those positive performance attributes. So a much better use for a genetic test would be to screen individuals at a young age and put forward welfare friendly, the 3 Fs to prevent those stereotypies from ever becoming manifest. And on to the final slide, please, Seb. So just some conclusions here, folks. It's really important to meet the behavioral needs of the horse. The 3 Fs, friends, forage, freedom. If we follow those fundamental management principles, then we can guard against and maybe prevent the development of those receptor-based changes that we see in the striatum in the first place. Because once those receptor-based changes are in place, the chances of undoing them is fairly slim. Those sensitized brain regions, particularly the mesoaccumbens pathway, is hyper-responsive to palatable foods. And indeed, the sensitization process can be linked in part to the feeding of highly palatable cereal-based concentrates. So again, that's something that we want to cut down. Friends, forage, freedom. So try and cut down those cereal-based concentrates. There is tentative evidence to suggest enhanced competition performance, and maybe this should start to undo some of the negative associations that we attach to stereotypy. Then finally, in light of some of the cognitive differences that have been uncovered, we might have to think about adapted training regimes, particularly for crib biters who learn fast. and then don't unlearn very easily. So we do have to make sure that perhaps we train them with care, and that we teach them the right thing the first time in our day-to-day training regimes. I don't know, is there anything else you wanted to add there, Seb, in terms of conclusions?
No, I think that's probably a nice point to stop, I think, Andy, especially given the time. We've been talking a lot, so we can maybe let some people ask some questions, and that will maybe take us in any other direction that we might want to go.
Thank you both so much. That has been a real sort of, not necessarily a whirlwind, but I really love these webinars because you bring some really technical information and understanding to us in a very understandable way. So as I say, it's been really informative. And as you quite nicely segued in there, Seb, that now is obviously the Q&A time. So I've got a few questions that I would like to get the ball rolling with. But if any of our audience, either on Zoom or on YouTube, have any questions, I say now is the time. If you're on Zoom, there's the Q&A tab. If you don't have a question, if you still check out the Q&A tab, if anyone's watching, and you can upvote the questions that you would most like to be asked. And then if you're on, I say YouTube, put them in the comments section, and we will whisk them over here as well. So yeah, thank you both so much for that. So as I say, I have a couple of questions just to get the ball rolling. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you to ask kind of what role do hormones play in the development and maintenance of stereotypic behaviours?
Well, I'll perhaps take that slightly broader and think slightly more broadly about signaling molecules and neurotransmitters, maybe rather than hormones. And certainly we've already explored the role of the key neurotransmitter dopamine, but that's only really one part of it, because in our research, myself and Seb have uncovered some other quite wide-ranging receptor-based differences to other neurotransmitter systems, such as the systems that are controlled by neurotransmitters known collectively as the endogenous opioids. And some of you may have heard of the endorphins, for example. And we've revealed that the endorphin systems of the crib biter are also hypersensitized. And it's the endorphin system that really responds to highly palatable foodstuffs such as polos and coarse mixes and what have you. And as soon as a horse eats one of those, there's a boost of endorphins in that animal's brain. And all of those bind to these highly sensitized systems, which then kick in the dopamine, the nucleus accumbens, and the whole thing becomes somewhat of a self-perpetuating loop. So two principal brain hormones or neurotransmitters, dopamine certainly, but don't ignore the endogenous opioids, which includes the endorphins, which are released following the ingestion of palatable foods. And again, if your horse has started a stereotypy such as crib biting, it's possible that you can reduce the frequency of crib biting in that horse without physical prevention devices by simply feeding that animal a diet which is based around high quality forage rather than highly palatable concentrate feeds, because of this neurohormonal control.
And it's almost going back to one of your key messages at the end there about the importance of the 3 Fs, isn't it? Again, just that forage within that diet.
Yeah, definitely.
And sorry, so I've got a question for you, but I just also wanted to quickly highlight that actually how international our audience is tonight, like it is on many nights. So we've got people from all over the UK, we've got Sweden, Finland, top of Scotland, far north of Scotland, London and everything. So we've got, like, as I say, a very nice international audience for us tonight. Seb, is there a particular breed of horse that is more likely to develop stereotypies?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one, really. I mean, if you look at the data, then it would nearly suggest that thoroughbreds, for example, are maybe more predisposed to performance stereotypy. But what's always very difficult to disentangle is the husbandry and the use of those animals versus their genetics. So, I mean, there's been some heritability studies that suggest that that there is genetic predisposition, like Andy was saying as well. this is work that we are very keen to get into to try and assess and identify the genetic basis of equine stereotypy. If it has a genetic basis, then that would also suggest that there's going to be breeds, because obviously breeds are about differences in genetics, that there are going to be breeds that are more susceptible than others. But currently we're not in a very strong place. Like I say, thoroughbreds seem to perform at a slightly higher rate than the general population, but that might reflect as much the husbandry and use of that particular group of animals.
Yeah, and that makes sense, and this actually kind of leads quite nicely into Andrew's next question, which I know you have actually covered quite nicely, Andrew, already. But like, how important is the 3Fs in both managing a horse with stereotypic behaviour and also preventing those behaviours?
Yeah, well, we're coming back to this whole idea of quite widespread changes to brain structures. And again, we were quite surprised when we went in and looked. We got some widespread differences, particularly in the caudate and putamen. And looking from or across the species to the rodents, for example, those changes are brought about by chronic stress in tandem with genotype. And by depriving an animal of the 3Fs, depriving a horse of the 3Fs, we are in fact subjecting that horse to 3 levels of chronic stress, which is highly likely to have these changes to receptor number that we've recorded in our work. I'll say again, looking at the rodent studies, those receptor-based changes are fairly long-lasting, and getting those to reverse once they become manifested is incredibly difficult. So it's quite important that we head things off at the pass and stop the manifestation of those receptor changes before they occur. And the best way of doing that is via the provision of the 3Fs, friends, forage, and food. Once the behavior has become manifested, I think we can reduce the prevalence of those behaviors somewhat by the provision of the 3Fs. But the chances of ever stopping that behavior completely, once they've become fully manifest, is fairly minimal. There might be an opportunity to get in there once the appetitive behavior becomes stereotypic at the very inception point of behaviors that resemble stereotypy. I think there probably is an opportunity to undo things by chucking the horse in the field and provision of the 3Fs. But I think the take-home message is once those receptor-based changes have occurred, undoing them is really difficult. So it's better to provide the 3Fs up front before the crib biting, weaving, or box walking is developed.
So yeah, the prevention is better than cure for sure in this situation. And Seb, well, I'm just going to now start going on to our audience Q&A. We've had a question in from Daniel from YouTube, and it kind of is a bit similar, but he's saying that it's difficult to stop cribbing, but are there any strategies that you know of that have had some success in reducing cribbing?
Yeah, very tricky, as Andy was sort of talking about there. I mean, the picture that I had right at the front of the presentation, a horse crib biting on a post. So that horse then had come, that was an ex-race horse that then went to a hacking yard, and then we ended up with that horse on a trial, and then that horse in fact came back home to me, and that horse then essentially had sort of the equine life of Riley. It was very much out there with other horses. It had free access to probably about 4 to 5 acres. It was on forage then. There was no concentrates in its life. So we were meeting all of those 3Fs in a quite an abundant way. And as you can see from that particular picture, that horse was still going up, finding a post and spending a predominant amount of its day crib biting. So it is very, very, very difficult. I mean, anecdotally, I have heard people talking about acupuncture as potentially a way of reducing the amount of crib biting that some horses have done. I mean, acupuncture is quite interesting in terms of the neurophysiological consequence that it has. And in fact, when you look at some of the literature on that and the parts of the brain that it's affecting, that ties in very closely with some of the parts of the brain that we've been talking about. But no formal study has ever been done really looking at sort of the efficacy of acupuncture in terms of a crib biting reduction method. So again, we're sort of a bit stuck. The only thing I would say is that I think that there is potentially a window of opportunity. And again, Andy alluded to that in response to the last question, where if you can catch the animal at that point when it is in the appetitive phase, whenever it is showing all sorts of behavior that are to do with an appetitive response, a frustration response in relation to the goal-directed behavior that it cannot attain because of the restrictive environment that it finds itself in, then I think that there is an opportunity there to potentially get in and make a radical change in the animal's husbandry to sort of change the behavioral trajectory in that sense away from stereotypy. Some of the evidence, there was a very good study that was done by Amanda Waters way back when, one of the few studies that has looked at stereotypy longitudinally, so really looking at the development of these behaviors over time. And one of the things that comes out of that study is that there's quite a large proportion of foals that are performing stereotypy, between 14 and about 15%. Yet you don't see those sort of percentages in the overall adult population. And what that suggests is that some of those animals then are not becoming stereotypic adults. Okay. And so that might reflect to some degree changes that have gone on in terms of the animal's husbandry within that window of opportunity that essentially rescued the animal, have retrieved it away from that trajectory towards equine stereotypy.
No, that does sound positive in that sense, definitely. Yeah. We've got a few, I say a few questions now coming through on our Q&A. So I'm going to jump to you, Andrew, to ask this one from Emma, saying, like, is it possible for a horse to learn a stereotypical behavior from another horse?
God, that's a great question, and again, it's one that we don't really know much about. There's been about 3 or 4 studies, and probably 3 of those studies looked at observational learning, and the results of those studies were that it's highly unlikely that via observational learning, stereotypy can be picked up by another animal. So the research tells us probably no. However, there are alternative ways of looking at this, and I'll tell you a very quick story which might seem a little bit tangential. I was on my way back from a conference in Dublin once, and the undercarriage on the plane failed to retract. So the wheels didn't go back into the fuselage. So we had to go out over the Irish Sea, dump the fuel, and then come back in to do an emergency landing. And after that, I was pretty blooming afraid of flying. Okay. And even to this day, if I'm sat by my wife on a flight, she'll see my knuckles going white, and my blink rate going up, and me just looking really worried. And that's enough to make her feel worried. And I have a feeling that if you've got a horse in the stable next door doing, this repetitive stall walking or weaving and seeming fairly het up and ultra stressed, I think that dimension might be contagious. It might have an effect of stressing out the horses more around it. So maybe via that mechanism, there might be a contagious element to stereotypy. But interocular learning, observational learning, I don't think so. I don't know, Seb, what do you think?
Yeah, I think probably you've summed it up quite well there, Andy. I think that the evidence suggests that it's not sort of contagiously learnt from one horse to another. I mean, again, you always hear anecdotal reports of somebody saying, oh, I put my horse in and there was a crib biter next door, and 2 months later, my horse was crib biting. But I think really at the essence, you've described it there, is that those animals that that are placed beside other stereotypic animals become stereotypic, A, they're predisposed to becoming stereotypic anyway, and probably they're being placed in an environment which is potentially suboptimal, which is probably why the horse beside it was crib-biting in the first place, plus, you know, the effect that having a stereotypic animal has in terms of creating, again, a further suboptimal environment for the animal that's initially non-stereotypic that then becomes stereotypic. So in terms of looking at other horses and thinking, oh, look, that looks like a good thing to do, and picking it up through some sort of learning process, I think all of the evidence suggests that that's definitely not the case.
And maybe actually to more look at, say, if it's on a yard, looking at the more like holistic management aspects
exactly
of
that.
Yeah.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And we've got a few Emma's asking a few questions, which is quite nice. So another one from an Emma saying, now we're heading into winter. A lot of people at liveries often have no choice but to stable. Is there anything that we can do to help those horses, i.e. enrichment, or will this make this worse? And I'll give that to you, Seb, please.
Yeah, I mean, that's always tricky, really. But again, we'd go back to our 3Fs, really, in that sense, and that really you want to be avoiding highly palatable food substrates just because of the neurophysiological consequence that has. I mean, we've predominantly been talking about stress here and how stress can potentially lead to this upregulation of the dopaminergic system, but palatable feeds will also do the same thing. And it's also possible that the horse hasn't evolved in terms of its neurophysiology to deal with the neurophysiological consequence of palatable feed substrates very well. And it seems to hit on that part of the brain. So definitely avoid all of that. You know, ad libitum, low quality forage is definitely the way forward. There has been work in the past which is really just looked at the number, a very simple study in actual fact. This was for weavers, and they looked at the amount of weaving in horses that had 1 window versus 2 windows versus 3 windows. And the more visual access that you give the horse, or the more sort of visual access in terms of other horses, but also just visual access generally to things that are going on in its environment, all of that then seems to significantly reduce the amount of stereotypy that the animal will perform. So there's that. I mean, obviously we could be talking about enrichment and enrichment devices, but those can be a little bit tricky because some of the enrichment devices can, especially for very feed motivated animals, can actually in fact cause more frustration and in fact lead to even more stereotypy. It is possible, though, to, you know, we think of horses as grazers predominantly, but they are equally browsers in many ways. And, you know, you can enrich the environment by sort of offering different forms of browse. And again, some work has been done in that area, and that seems to work quite well in terms of enriching the animal's environment nutritionally. And no formal studies done in the context of stereotypy, but I would imagine that that would be beneficial in that respect. And then also, I mean, there's a push now for, you know, social stabling, isn't there? So, you know, really thinking about, okay, maybe visual access, but maybe some opportunity for tactile access as well. And a paper is just, I'm an editor on applied animal behavior science. Quite an interesting paper has just come through on chat hatches, their use in horses, and you know, how that changes the behavior within the stable environment. Again, that particular study wasn't from a stereotypic behavior, but from an enrichment perspective, again, I could see all of that being beneficial from a stereotypic perspective. So I think there's a number of things that you can do, really just thinking about, you know, what are the species specific behavioral needs of the horse, which, you know, aligns to these 3Fs. They're, you know, they're all about eating for prolonged periods of time, being able to get access to conspecifics, other horses, and then obviously, you know, the turnout thing is more of a difficult thing then, really, isn't it? That sort of that third behavior that they're sort of evolved to do is much more difficult during the winter months, especially in the UK, just because it's very difficult to get the turnout time. But I mean, obviously, you know, horses can be walked and exercised, and horse walkers and stuff like that. So just the normal sorts of things, I guess, that people tend to be doing during the winter months.
Thank you, and I think no, and I think you've really nicely summarised that. Actually, when we think about enrichment, we kind of shouldn't fail to think about those real basic needs of the three Fs actually first. And
Yeah.
as you say, there's ways in which that we can hopefully be providing that more regularly. We are obviously getting quite pushed for time, so I'm going to see if we can be ask you to be quite succinct with answers now, and see if we can get through. We've got 10
Yes.
questions left on the board. We'll see if we can get
Yes
through
and
them.
no answers only.
Although, but Andrew, this is quite a meaty one for me to ask you with this. So, how do we persuade this from an Emma? How do we persuade the racing industry to adopt the three Fs?
I think they're becoming more open and more enlightened to this. But Emma, just to put it in a real nutshell, we really have to prove the links between three Fs and increased health, which increases performance. So days out of training as a result of gastric ulcers. I dread to think. And a GastroGuard costs the average trainer thousands and thousands of pounds a year. And if we can link the three Fs to performance, health, financial benefits, I think that's probably the way to connect.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Seb, there's another Emma. I was also wondering, do we ever see stereotypies in wild/semi-feral horses? And would they present, or would any of these stereotypies present differently?
That's a nice, easy one to be succinct on. The answer to that is no. We do not.
Very telling. Andrew, where can we find out more about adapting training regimes for horses with stereotypical behaviour?
Probably the 2015 paper, the Roberts et al. That would be a good start. So I can send that over. I don't know whether that could be posted somewhere. I don't know that it's open access. That's the only problem. I do have a YouTube video I could also share that has some relevance to that, which I can ping over to you after we finish tonight.
Great. So what we can try and do then is maybe put it onto our YouTube channel chat for this webinar. We can probably hopefully put that link on there.
Okay.
I'm sure Basil will ping me a message if there's going to be something different. That's great. Thank you very much, Andrew. Seb, there's one from a Sue. So do you have any thoughts, evidence on what prompts development of tendency to either oral or movement orientated stereotypies? And is one or the other, and is it always one or the other, or is this more broad?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And it tends to be you either have crib biters or you have weavers. It's pretty rare that you get a crib biter that's also a weaver. But they do exist. They do exist, but they're pretty rare in the population. And I guess that relates to the thwarted motivation, to the thing that they cannot attain. So there are some animals that are more locomotory oriented in terms of their goals. There's other animals that are more food motivated in their goals, and that seems to then determine the stereotypy that they then develop. It's a good point though, because in the model that we've been presenting, we're talking about an upregulated part of the brain that's responsible for motivation. So what you would expect those animals to be is very motivated to perform locomotory goals and also very motivated to perform oral orientated goals. That doesn't seem to be the case. So the model that we've presented is quite I guess presents a reasonable model across the spectrum, but there are some caveats to that would relate to this issue, the fact that you only get some horses that are locomotory and some that are oral in that sense.
Thank you. And Andrew, there's one here from Deborah saying, is there a sex-related difference in the presence of stereotypic behaviours? Can it be motivated by differences in the neurophysiology between males and females?
God, now you're testing my knowledge of the literature, Deborah, and oh gosh, I do need to read more. I can't recall reading anything about sex-linked differences in stereotypic predisposition. I know there are some studies which look at dopamine receptor numbers and some gender-based differences in other species such as humans, but I don't recall reading anything in the horse that links to that.
Great, thank you. There's one from Jelena. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Do you have any, Seb, sorry, this is for you. Do you have any advice on how to make peace between positive reinforcement, so food rewards, and reduction of palatable food when training a highly motivated cribber?
So yeah, I mean, I guess what you can do there obviously is work with a secondary reinforcer with intermittent use of your primary reinforcer, and that primary reinforcer doesn't always have to be highly palatable, you know, to keep the, so if we're talking about something like clicker training, for example, so you know, you need to keep the saliency of the clicker loaded up by using your primary reinforcer. But you could be using things like carrots to, you know, keep it loaded, but then predominantly within your training, use the secondary reinforcer rather than the primary reinforcer would be the advice going forward there.
And I have seen sort of people using like sort of a, you know, like a non-molasses chaff and things like that to kind of really try and reduce the I suppose the, you know, the palatability and things.
Yeah.
And there's another question here for Andrew. I'll pass it to you, from Emma, saying, if a horse weaves and windsucks, are the impacts cumulative / combined?
Gosh, I know, like Seb says, you do get both behaviors in the same package, but rarely so. And I have a feeling it would really be quite difficult to establish a sample population of a suitable size to test that experimentally. So again, there's nothing in the literature that would support a cumulative effect that I'm aware of. And I, you know, again, if we're thinking about the brain-based changes that certainly leads to crib biting, the cognitive testing data would suggest that weavers, because they don't progress to habit formation that easily, would suggest they have an upregulated accumbens, but maybe an intact, normal functioning caudatus. So I think the changes would be relatively similar between the two populations, with the caveat I've just introduced. Whether they'd be cumulative if both behaviors were rolled into the same animal, I'm not entirely sure, I'll be completely honest. And it would be a difficult thing to test because you've got to find those animals.
Thank you.
So not sure about that one,
Not
unfortunately.
sure, that's fine. That's a perfectly valid answer. And we've got lots of nice comments coming through as well. But there's one here from Caitlin, and I'm going to ping this to you, Seb, saying, what do you think about cribbing colours?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Caitlin. And let me just show you this then quickly. So again, this is study way back. What we're looking at here are plasma cortisol levels. So what we're using cortisol here as a marker for stress. We've got three groups of horses. We've got control animals, crib biting animals, and weaving animals. So you've got yellow, blue, and red. So the yellow is saline, so take that as control. Then you've got the use of the crib strap, which is sort of that blue color, and then anti-weave bar is in red. So the control animals, they were non-stereotypic, and they got the control period, they got the crib strap, and they got the anti-weave bar. And then the crib biting horses, they had control, and then they had the crib strap. And then the weaving animals, they had control, and then they had the anti-weave bar. And what you can see, if you're looking at the crib biting horses only, you can see that little asterisk at the top there indicates statistically that there's a significant difference, that the crib strap, the crib biting horses that had the crib strap had significantly elevated levels of plasma cortisol. So crib biting horses, when you put that device on them, become stressed. What confounds the message a little bit here is that if you look at the control animals, you can see that they've also got little asterisks above both when they had the crib strap on and the anti-weave bar. Remember, those animals are not doing any stereotypy. So just the placement of these devices, just the placement of the cribbing collar or the placement of the anti-weave bar seemed to induce a stress response in non-stereotypic animals. So that, alongside the fact that in the crib biting horses, they're also getting a significant increase in cortisol, would strongly suggest that we should not be using these types of devices on the horse.
Thank you. And it does come through really clearly. And final question, and I do need you to do it in about like a sentence, Andrew. Sorry, because we're really tight in time. But all very well, it's from Simon. All very well about the three Fs for horses who are box stabled at night, but what about horses who live out and obviously show stereotypic behaviours?
Oh, I think it comes back to this whole recalcitrant nature of the brain-based changes. You know, once they're there, we're probably not going to undo them. And you know, the example of Seb's old horse Tom is a really good one there that Seb brought in. You know, he provided the three Fs in abundance, but the horse would still find his favorite cribbing post and crib away. So I think, Alana, you nailed it earlier on. Prevention is better than cure. We can provide the three Fs in abundance, but it's not necessarily going to reduce the behavior completely.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to come back to you both in a second just to get a take-home message. But just before I do that, I just want to quickly mention our next webinar, which will be next Wednesday, the 11th of December. We'll be joined by equine nutritionist Claire McLeod and Liz Bilbrook to explore some more nutrition-related myths. So, as I say, that link now should be in both the chat here and also on the YouTube channel as well. So yeah, sort of just flipping back to who wants to go first. Seb, can I ask you to go first, please, for a quick take-home message for all our
yeah, well, I think
listeners?
I know what Andy's going to say, but so I'll not say that. I'll not steal his thunder. I suppose what I would just say is, I think I would just reiterate prevention is always going to be better than cure when it comes to stereotypy. In fact, it's not that it's better, it's really the only way that we can get on top of these behaviors.
Great, thank you very much for that. And Andrew?
I don't know if this is the one that Seb's thinking of, but I'm going to go for it anyway. The welfare reductions that we see in crib biters, weavers, and box walkers are all due to the way us as human keepers respond to those behaviors. And it's the management strategies, the preconceived ideas, and the old wives' tales that lead to these welfare reducing management strategies that Seb's just been through: the crib strap, the anti-weave grid, and so on. So I think it's incumbent on us as the enlightened horse keepers to kind of take that message out and spread that message. And this whole notion of this tentative evidence that we have for maybe even enhanced performance might go some way to connecting with horse owners.
And that's been, and I just going to reiterate, if you look at the chat for like a few seconds, you'll see the mass amounts of thanks that's coming through to both of you for tonight's session. It's been, yes, very informative, and thank you so much for bringing all the technical information and science to us in our own homes. It's been really, really nice, and thank you very much to all the participants who attended as well. And as I say, make it obviously much more enjoyable to be doing these webinars when we know we've got other people out there listening as well. So a big thank you, and as I say, please do join us next time for our nutrition webinar on the 11th of December. And if anyone does have any other sort of ideas on what webinars they'd like to see coming up, then please do email us at education@worldhorsewelfare.org. So yeah, once again, thank you both very much for your time this evening. It's been really, really great.
Oh, you're more than welcome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.